Okay, the reading for this week is Kōda Rohan, one of the great writers of the Meiji period. His famous work, masterpiece in my view, Taidokuro, or Encounter with Skull, as translated by Chieko Mulhern. I will include the link to Chieko Mulhern's translation in the description below, along with links to the original Japanese text, and we can read those all, so you can read along with me. Okay, and in this video I'm going to be going over the study guide that I've made for this, and I have a link to the study guide, so you can follow along the study guide as you listen to me talk about it. And then after I finish, I will hand the microphone over to my assistant Nicole, who will give, as always, a mellifluous, beautiful reading of the story in full. It's about 30 pages in the PDF file that I have, so it should take about 30-40 minutes, maybe 50 max. Alright, before I jump into the study guide though, I want to introduce you to a antecedent source that kind of informs this work. And although Kōda Rohan doesn't refer to this work explicitly in his story, there are hints that he's drawing from this famous story, or kind of incident, that appears in the Shinkokinshu in the Heian period, and late Heian period, and appears repeatedly after that in various classical sources and medieval sources. And it's basically the story of Saigyo and the prostitute from Eguchi. So just very briefly, I want to introduce you to that work. Okay, so it's the famous encounter between monk Saigyo and the chief prostitute of Eguchi. This incident appears in numerous classical works. First, actually, in Saigyo's kind of a poetic diary that he wrote, and then after that, and more importantly, in the Shinkokin Wakashu that was put out in 1206 approximately. The Shinkokin Wakashu, we'll go over that in class, and we'll go over some of these sources in class. I'll bring in some excerpts from these texts so we can compare Kōda Rohan's story to these. So after that, it appeared in the Senjusho, which was compiled in the late 13th century in two of the Setsuwa, or kind of what's the translation of Setsuwa? Kind of incident stories from that work. And then later in Zeami's famous no play Eguchi, he draws from this story as well. And so what is this story exactly? It's as follows. So one evening in the late Heian period, the itinerant Shingon priest and poet Saigyo, the great sort of poet of the late Heian period, finds himself caught in a sudden shower on his way to the Tennoji temple. And this is from my my book, by the way. I have 2 or 3 paragraphs about this work in the context of Ishikawa Jun's famous essay about the Edo period, and he talks about this legend in this work. So these are 2 paragraphs from chapter 7 of my book. Finds himself caught in a sudden shower on his way to the Tennoji temple. Upon wandering into the brothel district of Eguchi, he stops at an inn to ask the prostitute of the house, a prostitute named Eguchi no Kimi, and occasionally in some of the versions of this tale, actually her name is referred to as Tai, which of course is the same name as the female character in this work. Okay, so but in the Shinkokinshu version, he runs into Eguchi no Kimi and he asks her to allow him to stay for the remainder of the night. She refuses, insisting that his duty as a world-renouncing monk is to renounce all worldly passions, including his desire for temporary dwelling, or kari no yado, by which she means her brothel, and by extension her body. In the version of the story included in the Senjusho, which is written after this, in the Setsuwa tales, the prostitute actually lets him in. So according to the different sources, there are slight variations in the story. Okay, here's the famous poetic dialogue between monk Saigyo, as included in the Shinkokinshu, starting with the poem that Saigyo composes on a rainy night after he's refused entry into her brothel to stay for the night. And he writes, Yono naka o ito made koso katakarame kari no yadori oshimu kimi kana, which in my translation, or I might have borrowed my advisor Anthony Chambers' translation, the world of love must indeed be hard to put aside, but selfishly you deny me even this fleeting shelter. And Eguchi no Kimi famously responds to his poem with a poem of her own that playfully mocks Saigyo, warning him not to cling to the fleeting transient dwellings, kari no yado, of this world. And she writes, Yo itou 人とし聞けば仮の宿に心富むなと思うばかりぞ. Hearing that you are one who shuns the world of love, I worry lest you dwell upon this fleeting borrowed shelter. And scholars often note how this famous exchange puns on the Buddhist phrase kari no yado, which frequently appears in classical literature to denote a temporary dwelling, and by extension the evanescence of human life and the transient pleasures of the flesh. The prostitute of Eguchi deliberately uses the phrase in all three senses, literal, spiritual, and sexual. And then just briefly about Zeami's no play from the 14th century, Eguchi, the story appears again, this time with a new central character, an anonymous prostitute, and an added twist. In the second half of the play, the prostitute, now in the role of the Nochijite, or the principal actor, or state in the second part of a no play who appears after the Naka-iri, discloses that she is the ghost of the celebrated prostitute of Eguchi. In the play's final scene, this ghost reveals herself to be the manifestation of the Bodhisattva Fugen, the Bodhisattva of universal virtue, flying westward into the clouds on a white elephant, as the line appears in the play, in the no play, the no drama. As always, Ishikawa provides none of this. Okay, that's not really relevant. And here's the final. Okay, that's some general basic information to the antecedent sources that inform this play. And we'll go over these in more detail in class, but keep that story of monk Saigyo and the lady or courtesan or prostitute of Eguchi in the back of your mind as you read this. That is sort of the hold on, let me pause it real quick here. Okay, now just very briefly, I will go over the study guide, and I've already made another video about this, and I'll put the link to that previous video that I made 2 years ago, that I go into a little more detail about all these things that are on the study guide. You can watch that as well. Just very briefly, study guide for Kōda Rohan's Encounter with Skull, 1890. These are 10 terms you need to know. Allegory, which derives from the Greek word allegoria, meaning speaking otherwise. We've gone over this in class before. Allegory is basically any story that can be read on two levels, so that everything, all the major characters and events and so forth in the story correspond to something that is more abstract and so forth, so that there's kind of two lines of the story, the literal line of the plot in the story, and then this allegorical meaning of the story. Can this work be read as an allegory? Something we'll go over in class. Allusion is a direct reference in a literary work to a person, place, or thing in history or another work of literature. So there are various allusions, or genkyu, or as we say in Japanese, in this work, and identify them as you read. And keep in mind that allusion and intertextuality, or kantekistose, as we say in Japanese, are very close, very linked. However, there's some slight and important differences between the two. An allusion is a direct reference to a previous work of art or literature or history or so forth. Intertextuality is kind of on a more kind of subconscious or unconscious or indirect or unintentional level, so that there's all kinds of resonances with previous works of literature. However, it's not referred to specifically. So in this work, for example, except for the name of the female character, Tai, there are no direct references to, as far as I know, there might be actually, if we go back and read it, but there are not many direct references to that famous tale of Saigyo and Eguchi no Kimi in the work. However, intertextually, there are all kinds of links and involved, and we'll go over that in class. Archetype, you know what an archetype is. A universal symbol or type based on a recurring character, recurring type that occur throughout a literary tradition and so forth. Didactic literature is literature written with the expressed intent to teach something, usually something ethical in nature. Okay, so Kōda Rohan is writing in a period when the didactic purpose of literature is kind of being thrown out, as aestheticism and Kant's ideas of the art, pour art, and so forth are coming into Japan. But he's saying, no, the fundamental, the primary purpose of writing these works is to teach the truth of Buddhism. Right? He explicitly says that in several of his essays, and this work too, although it's extremely entertaining and funny and wild and so forth, it is also has a Buddhist message that it's trying to convey, and we'll go over that in class too. Aestheticism, or tanbiha in Japanese, we know what that is. This is art for art's sake, a sensibility or philosophy that regards the creation of aesthetic pleasure as the ultimate or proper aim of art. And then I have a sort of narratological term here, because it's important to know these three terms really. Free indirect discourse. So I guess we can go over these more in class. Free indirect discourse, just very briefly. A third-person narration in which a character's thoughts or expressions are presented in the character's voice without being set off by quotation marks or the usual addition of phrases like he thought or she said and so forth, without shifting into grammatical first-person discourse. For example, quote, "It was a hot day. What on earth was she doing lugging stones on a day like this?" So the third-person narrator is saying, what on earth was she doing lugging stones on a day like this? But these are probably the exact words that appeared in her mind, and the narrator is borrowing those words and conveying them directly within the context of his third-person narrator. Okay, so if he did this for more than 5 or 6 or 10 lines, it would become interior monologue. But it hasn't gone that far. It's still embedded in his narrative. However, it kind of borrows the language that is actually appearing in the mind of one of the characters and embedding that in its own narrative. That's called free indirect discourse. And you want to compare this narrative technique with direct discourse, which is the simply she said, why is it so hot? Why is it so hot? She said. So it's obvious that the narrator there is conveying exactly what the character said. That's called direct discourse. And then there's also indirect discourse, namely she wondered why it was so hot. So she actually thought to herself, why is it so hot? And that is embedded in the sentence. We'll go over this a little bit more in detail, and it becomes more complicated in Japanese since the rules of using quotation marks are very different. There's much more fluidity between these three modes. However, when you are translating into English, at least, you have to keep in mind these three modes, as well as a fourth mode, namely interior monologue, which is usually set off by italics, and you have to be a little more clear about which one of these four modes you're using when writing in English. Alright, number 7, Genbun Ichi. This is the modern colloquial style. First advocated in the 1880s, it became the dominant mode of writing after 1895. By 1910, the style had become so widespread that the term was no longer used. Okay, so when Kōda Rohan is writing the story in 1890, Genbun Ichi as a kind of ascendant style exists. However, he kind of rejects it and insists on writing in a very different style in this work, which is why it's very difficult for Japanese students these days to read this work in the original, because it's very different from things written after 1910, which are very close to works that are written just in the past few years, right? So after 1910, everything becomes standardized, for the most part, into this Genbun Ichi style, but this work is written in what is on your study guide as number 8, namely Gazoku Setchutai. This is the refined colloquial mixed style. This style first emerged during the Edo period, and then from 1890 to 1895 there was a brief return to this style in the literary world as a kind of response to Genbun Ichi from writers who were dissatisfied with the new Genbun Ichi style and insisted on retaining this older style. But this all ended, for the most part, with the anti-Chinese sentiment that reached fever pitch during the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So the war between Japan and China in 1895 kind of turns the Japanese against the Chinese, and by extension turns them against this older style of writing, which incorporates a lot of Chinese. So obviously you look at the first page of Kōda Rohan, the original, there are a lot of Chinese expressions, Chinese phrases, obscure kanji that most Japanese today don't know how to read. And that's called the Gazoku Setchu style. Next, on number 9, Bunmei Kaika. So numbers 9 and 10 on your study guide are two very important slogans that kind of capture the zeitgeist of the Meiji period. The first is Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, it's often translated as. This is the chief slogan of the Meiji period. By leaving the city in this story, the hub of modern civilization and enlightenment, so Tokyo is the hub of Bunmei Kaika, by leaving this hub, the character Rohan in the story seems to be searching for something that is not offered by any of these new Bunmei Kaika enlightenment ideals. What he seeks is something more fundamental, more primal, more urgent, more spiritual. So this kind of a work can be read as this kind of spiritual journey of a man who turns his back on the modernity, modernization, westernization, and so forth that are happening in Japan at the time, and goes in search of something more fundamental. And number 10 is the other major slogan. There are several others, but the two that are relevant to this work is the second one here, Risshin Shussei, the Meiji Era ethos of personal advancement. which came about after the abolition of the Shi no Kōshō official class system. Shi no Kōshō, if you don't know these 4 words, these 4 kanji, memorize them now. Shi is the bushi class, the samurai class. No is the agriculture or the peasant or the farmer class. Ko is the artisan class, and Shō is the merchant class. And I think in Confucius's Analects, if I'm not mistaken, he delineates these 4 levels of the class system, putting the bushi class, the shu, on top, the samurai class on top, and the merchants on the bottom, famously. Japanese Neo-Confucianists in the Edo period, or just before the Edo period, imported this, and it became kind of the basis for society. And that all disappears in the Meiji period with westernization, modernization, and so forth. So they scrapped this Shi no Kōshō official class system, and they all set their minds, their hearts to attaining Risshin Shusei, or kind of pulling themselves up in the world financially, making a lot of money, rising in status, and so forth. So there's a kind of critique of this Risshin Shusei ideology in this work that we will discuss in class. Okay, those are the introductory terms. Now, the 15 questions that are on your study guide, I will go over them briefly. Okay, now just very briefly, there's 20 study questions. There are 3 parts in this story. There are no chapters, but there are 3 kind of major sections. Part 1, question number 1. Briefly look at the original. Is it written in the Genbun Ichi style that I just described, the colloquial modern style? Or is it written in the Gazoku Setju style? Explain why you think this is the case, either is the case. Number 2, what is the point of view in the story? Is it a first-person story or a third-person story, basically? Obviously, look at the first sentence. The original Japanese starts with a super long sentence. It doesn't have the watashi or watashi no or anything like that, but the translation includes it. So if you look at the translation, it's apparent that it's written in the first person, right? And this first sentence, by the way, is a masterpiece. It goes on for it's a run-on sentence, but it's very smooth. The first period of the work doesn't come until halfway through that page. In the Bunkobon, it's probably page 2 or 3 that the first super long sentence actually ends. All right, so what is this point of view of the story? How would you describe the narrator? Is he a reliable narrator? Should we trust what he has to say? Describe this guy named, who calls himself Rohan. The narrator says that he has made himself a companion of the dew, thus the name Rohan, which is Tsuyu no Han, or companion of the dew. Keep in mind that Tsuyu in Japanese is dew, and this is a very important image, or mochi image, or even metaphor in classical literature, and also in Buddhism. It's a very important image that is used often metaphorically, namely because the dew doesn't last through the morning, it disappears very quickly, so it's associated with ephemerality and so forth. So what does he mean by this? Why does he call himself the Rohan, or the companion of the dew? And furthermore, how does this character type of an aimless drifter or wanderer fit into the literary tradition, the Sino-Japanese literary tradition? And hint that some precedents for this type might include Matsuo Basho, the great poet of the Edo period, the Taoist sage Zhuangzi, the medieval wandering priest Saigyo, who we've already discussed at the beginning of this video, monk Saigyo, the great poet of the late Heian period, who runs into Eguchi no Kimi. He's also a wandering poet slash kind of priest looking for spiritual enlightenment. He was a priest. Romantic poets such as Wordsworth, etc., too, might inform this, because Kōda Rohan, although his focus was on the Sino-Japanese literary tradition, he was obviously still aware of things that were coming in from the West at the time, including the Romantic poets, such as Wordsworth. So that question is, can you find some precedents for this archetype that appears in this first-person narrator? Number 4, brief point, this isn't a question, but something you should always pay attention to, keep in mind as you read these stories. This story should make it clear that even when the author and the narrator share the same name, as in this case, Kōda Rohan, he wasn't born with the name Rohan, of course, but he took the pen name Rohan later in life, and he uses that pen name for this first-person character in the story, narrator in the story. Even when the author and the narrator share the same name, as in this case, the work should be read as a fictionalized narrative. So don't conflate the character in the story with the actual life of the writer. In short, avoid the watashi shousetsu mode of reading that conflates author and narrator. Alright, that's just a kind of warning. Number 5, identify where instances of foreshadowing in this work, or fukusen as we say in Japanese. They appear at several instances, especially in the first half. They kind of give hints of what will actually take place later in the work. Number 6, the young woman, Tai, her name is, and that name of course comes from one of the versions, or several of the versions, of the famous incident between monk Saigyo and the prostitute of Eguchi. The young woman offers Rohan a bath. How does he react? Might bathing be symbolic of something? Is this kind of ablution or purification ritual that he's that she's offering him? How does it relate to Rohan's inane, audacious ambition to endeavor to purify this frivolous world? Okay, so is this simply a kind of sexual act of a woman bathing a man, or is there some kind of spiritual meaning to it? Number 7, how does Tai convince him to come into bed with her? What is Rohan's moral dilemma once he does so? How does he cope with it? What does Rohan's reaction tell us about Buddhist ideas about women, desire, lust, bonno, and so forth? Okay, and keep in mind, in this scene, there are lots of resonances with the story of monk Saigyo and the prostitute of Eguchi. A lot of things that happen in that classical story happen in this as well. Okay, parts 2 and 3. Now, question number 9. Why is Rohan so adamant in resisting her advances? Why is he chanting Buddhist scriptures, namely the elimination of desire, while a half-naked, beautiful woman lies beside him? Is this intended to be comical? Why doesn't he just leave? Number 10. Identify the 3 types of love that appear in this work. How is Rohan's Buddhist-influenced view of woman, desire, love different from the young lord's Meiji Era chivalrous conception of love? So the other male character that Tai almost married when she was younger, kind of represents a very different understanding of love, which is sort of more platonic and kind of westernized and chivalrous and so forth. How is Tai's view of love different from these two? So in all, Rohan represents a certain understanding of what love is, romantic love is. That other male character represents another version of this, and Tai represents another one that we will discuss in class, the differences between these 3 symbols of love, or representations of love. Number 11, how are the usual gender roles reversed in this story? What does this reversal suggest? What is Rohan's initial reaction to this reversal? What is his second reaction? Okay, so this plays with some of the dominant gender ideas that were prevalent in the Meiji period. It kind of turns them on their head in some way, so we can discuss whether this work is a kind of proto-feminist work in some ways, or if it's drawing from a deeper, older tradition that has a much more nuanced understanding of gender and so forth. Number 12, who is more mature, experienced, wise? Tai, the female character, or Rohan? Who seems closer to a state of enlightenment? Explain. Okay, so keep in mind that both are kind of seeking enlightenment. Tai might have already achieved it. We'll discuss that in class too. Rohan is attempting to achieve it, but he's struggling and not meeting with much success. Number 13. Why does Tai think that men should be trusted? What kind of men does Tai despise? Where does she learn to despise them? Okay, this is a basic confirmation of plot kind of question, and you will want to look at the sections that are relevant to that in the work. Number 14, why does Tai's suitor fall so in love with her? So what does he find appealing in Tai? What is ironic about this? Number 15, why does she refuse the advances of her suitor? Why is she so persistent in her refusal? How does she react to his death? Does she feel any pity, remorse, or guilt? Number 16, discuss the ending. What is the significance of the grotesque description of Tai? What happened to her? What is the author trying to tell us about the nature of physical beauty, desire, and death? Number 17, and that of course relates to the issue of raibyo, or leprosy, that appears in this work, and we'll talk about this issue of leprosy, raibyo, in this work, and the sort of the status of raibyo in the Meiji period, and the sort of cultural associations that come along with that. Number 17, what was the mother's dying wish after all? What was Tai's hereditary curse? And this is the hereditary curse of laibyo, or leprosy, that her mother had, grandmother had, grandfather had, and she will eventually get it at some point, which is why she has to refuse the suitor's proposal for marriage despite being madly in love with him. Number 18. Philosophers, writers, critics have long argued over whether the primary goal of literature or art in general is to teach or to please. Should art instruct, or should it simply provide pleasure to its audience? Kōda Rohan believed that literature's primary goal was to instruct. He was a firm believer in literature's ability to liberate souls from ignorance and bondage. Although much admired by later aestheticists or Tanbiha writers such as Tanizaki Juichiro and others, Kōda Rohan was definitely not in their camp. So the question here is, how might this work, Taidokuro, be considered a didactic work of literature? What is the message it is trying to convey, explain? And the final question, number 19, discuss the theme of the conflict between giri, or moral obligations, and ninjo, human passions, as the theme appears in the work, and Tai's response to this conflict, dialectic. So giri versus ninjo is obviously a very important theme in Japanese literature, especially in the Edo period. Plays of chikamatsu and so forth, this tension between what society calls upon me to do and my own sort of private desires and what I want to do. It's obviously a universal theme that appears in all traditions of literature, but you might say it is especially prominent in Japanese tradition, and it appears in this work as well. And then finally, at the very end of the study guide, you have some particularities of culture that you need to look up, namely the Horai Mountain, or the Mount Panglai as it is in Chinese, which is this kind of imaginative mountain. It doesn't exist in the real world, but it's very prominent, features prominently in Chinese poetry of the Tang period, for example, as well as Chinese paintings, and it comes into Japan, associated with Taoism as well. The Chuzenji Temple appears in this, you need to look that up. Matsuo Basho's poem, an anecdote after turning down a prostitute. So this is a very famous poem by Matsuo Basho that he wrote. I forget where he included it, which work he included it in, but it's very famous, and the narrator in this story refers to it. And it's Kochida Muke, Ware mo sabishiki, aki no kure, is Matsuo Basho's response to a prostitute who is propositioning him at a brothel, evidently. And several others on your list, Mount Shirane, Mount Ara, mountains in Japan. So keep track of where the narrator is at all points in the story, and you can do that by looking up to see which kuni or province he is in at any given moment. The legend of courtesan Tai and Saigyo, or Eguchi no Himi, which I already discussed. The three spheres of hell appear in this. Arhat, which is a Buddhist term of a person who has achieved kind of enlightenment on a scholarly or intellectual level, but has not yet risen to the level of Bosatsu, if I remember correctly. Fujokan appears in this work. This is a very important Buddhist notion or practice that appears in several works by Tanizaki. It appears here, and you'll often find it in modern Japanese literature, and it's namely the practice of contemplation of the 9 stages of a decaying corpse. So for somebody who's trying to attain enlightenment and get rid of all the desires and human passions and so forth of this world, this practice, I'm not sure when exactly it begins, but I imagine it originates in China. But the person would stand in front of a corpse that had just died and stare at the corpse and watch every phase of the 9 phases of its putrefaction, of its rotting, of its decaying, and meditate on the impermanence of life. And after doing this, if all goes well, that person will have attained a kind of heightened state of consciousness or enlightenment, perhaps. Bodhisattva appears, we'll go over that in class. Nikko Genji Monogatari, Issei Monogatari, and other classical texts are referred to in this work. Alright, we'll go over all of these. We might have to spend 2 classes on this text because it is so dense and there's a lot to discuss. Alright, that's all from me. I will now turn over the microphone to Nicole, and she will read the translation by Mulhern. Alright, I shall now, I guess I can stop. Alright, here you go, Nicole.
Yeah.
Let's go to this. adjusted as always right there.
Okay. Encounter with the Skull, Taidokuro, 1890. It had never been in my nature to affect dandyism or to pursue elegant avocations. I was merely a 5-foot snail gadding about in all directions, driven by the desire to see as much of the world as could be perceived with the uncertain eyes of my antenna. So I started out on my journey, not caring whether a present-day lady of Eguchi refused me a night's lodging, as Tae, the courtesan, refused Saigyo, the medieval monk poet, or a nobleman of Uji begrudged me a fragrant cup of parched rice tea. Far from towns, I share with the dew a pillow of grass. This is a haiku that I composed some time ago in my solitary trip to the northern provinces, wayworn late at night in the field. Having made myself a companion of the dew, Rohan, destined eventually to drop off the tree branches, I had entertained no other wish than to die by the wayside, only to fertilize useless green moss in the gloomy shade of a large tree that was good for nothing but kindling. My daydreams, however, embraced an inane, audacious ambition. I shall endeavor to purify this frivolous world. My soul, storing such a wild fancy, had been roving vacuously for the past 30-some years. There is no tranquility in the life of a self-mocking man, and most of his actions are swayed by the winds of karma. Recalling such proverbs, I sometimes felt my heart chill and my bones burn on a wintry night of the year-end fair, or on a summer evening when bats fluttered about. Nevertheless, such a sober state of mind would last but for a few days, and I whiled away the time in idle relaxation. In April of 1890, I was at an inn by the hot water lake beyond Chuzenji at the foot of Mount Shirane, nursing my illness and practicing 5-stone checkers. No sooner had I recuperated, thanks to the healing power of the spa water, than I plunged into a state of euphoric animation, lustily quoting such sayings as, "A heroic man is inevitably possessed of soaring spirits that can challenge heaven." Feeling venturesome enough to disdain taking the same road back, I asked the innkeeper if there was a path leading forward. "Well, we are at the end of a mountain road," he advised. "As you can see, front Shirane and rear Shirane are towering above the clouds before us. Climbing them would be impossible even in the summertime. Next to them soars the Wildwood Pass, commonly known as the Spirits Pass, whose summit marks the border between Kozuke and Shimozuke provinces. Mountains pile up on one on top of the other, and there's not even a soul to offer you a drink of boiled water within 15 miles of here. The climate varies so much from place to place that the famous yashio flowers may be in full bloom in the Osawa and Tokujira areas, while the buds are still tight around here. Besides, you can hardly find the trail because the pass is totally covered with snow, as much as 5 or 6 feet deep in the valley. Only a handful of travelers have crossed these mountains since the beginning of the year. It's not a place one ventures into merely for fun. You have no choice but to return to the Chuzenji. You are better off traveling to some smaller mountain near human habitation, such as Mount Ashio or Mount Koshin." Does he take me for a city-bred weakling? I fumed to myself. I'll show him the cantankerous temper and the stubborn pride of a contrary man. In a sham display of force over such a trivial matter, I stood firm on my thin, cold legs, I despised long underwear, and insisted. "The pass doesn't scare me. Prepare grilled rice balls and go buy a pair of grass sandals for me. Slight hardship would be a small price to pay for the excitement of exploring a new trail. I'll entertain the mountain gods with my humming as I cross." Good heavens, how preposterous! Without snow boots, you'll surely freeze. If you're still determined to go, you should at least hire a guide to take you to the border. Do you intend to collect the native plant, Nikujuyo, noted as kidney medicine? If so, this isn't the season for it. You know the saying, a whimsical action is useless. Don't tell me such nonsense, I snapped at him. Just do as I say. Go hire a guide and buy some snow boots for me. Tucking up my kimono hems and securely typing on my boots, I started out valiantly to climb the mountain with my guide, a woodcutter 6 feet tall. After trudging several hundred yards, I was forced to concede that the innkeeper had been right. The snow was frozen hard on the surface, but quite soft and loose underneath. The ascent became steeper and steeper while my feet kept slipping. A bit discouraged, I spied my guide. To my annoyance, he was gaining ground steadily in his wild boar fur boots and iron snowshoes. Spurred on by my own ruffled pride and competitiveness, I had just caught up with him when the huge man turned on his heel and said, "It's impossible to find the footpath in the snow. We could follow the valley downward, or if you're willing to catch a little difficulty, we can take a shortcut to the peak, even though the climb is quite steep." "Might as well," I replied, resolved to proceed. We climbed on for another 3 miles. It was dark under thickly grown firs, pines, box trees, willows, and the like. The mountain lived up to its name, wildwood, so dense and ghastly was the forest. As the winds rustled through the treetops, the water droplets fell from the branches onto my neck, and the moist mountain air assailed my face and filled my lungs to sicken me. The rabbit and deer tracks in the snow gradually dismissed, and little by little the bird calls ceased to sound. While my body was damp from the ordeal of climbing, I felt as if the defiling robes of the 5 desires shrouded my mind had begun to peel off, one after another. The devil of consciousness, who raged unchecked in all his supernatural glory until the day before, now seemed humbled, deprived of his allies and kin. Somehow I lost my nerve. I felt as if I were a fugitive from the world. If a man should find himself in such a state of mind when he is nearing his end in decrepit old age with his senses almost gone, how wretched, helpless, and forlorn he must feel, I thought with unaccountable sorrow. At that very instant, from the dark treetops burst forth the cry of a bird, sharp enough to pierce a rock. Ducking in fright, I saw an arabesque pattern of fear swirl before my eyes. Then I heard the guide say, "I'll take my leave now. This is the peak separating the 2 provinces. Very left while descending through the valley down to marsh, and then down to a marsh, and then along its left perimeter until you find the headwaters of the Kandashina River, which is called the Tone River downstream. Its flow will lead you to the hot spring village of Ogawa, over 10 desolate miles from where we are now. Be careful not to lose your way. Now, farewell." I was left alone, feeling deeply forlorn. The sham courage I had displayed in the morning had already shriveled, and I looked vacantly down the mountain. The sunlight was weak under the leaden sky, and the Aizu Mountains, said to be visible on most days, were hidden behind the clouds. The tips of my toes were turning cold even as I stood there. I descended the mountain, alone and apprehensive. My snow boots kept slipping, my shins were buffeted by sharp jags of ice, my cheeks brushed against rocks, and my clothes tore on tree branches buried under snowdrifts. I walked and walked, but the marsh was nowhere to be seen. I began to wonder if I had lost my way. Breaking off some birch twigs, I made a fire to warm myself and ate the rice balls. Tasteless as wood shavings, they served at least to stave off hunger. Somewhat fortified, I proceeded, cautiously studying the terrain and correcting my direction. Since I disdained to own a watch, I couldn't even tell what time it was. To my horror, darkness was swiftly descending. "How dreadful," I groaned. The same thing had happened to me once before on my last trip to Mount Ara. "Not another ordeal like that," I prayed, hurrying on. At last, I found myself at the edge of a marsh. Leaving me no time to savor my relief, the sun set quickly in the valley. The ground was no longer snow-covered, but my feet hurt in the worn-out boots. To add to my chagrin, moreover, a boot string snapped in half. As I sat down by the path, pathetically trying to repair it, I caught sight of a light flickering faintly in the distance. Elated, I trudged toward it and came upon a small bamboo-thatched log hut standing beside a large cherry tree. To my surprise, its buds were still tight, indicating how late the spring was coming here. The hut was extremely simple, without so much as a crude fence, obviously dispensing with the nuisance of a garden gate. With a stream of about 6 feet wide running alongside, there was no need for the customary bamboo pipe to lead the water into the hut. Marveling that someone was able to live in such an austere fashion, I stood by the door through which light was filtering and said, "I am utterly exhausted and quite lost after crossing the ridge from the hot spring inn of Chuzenji. How far is Ogawa village? I'm also having trouble walking since my boot string broke. Would you be kind enough to spare me a pair of straw sandals? What a pity!" The voice came, strangely enough, in the charming voice of a woman. "Ogawa village is about 1.5 miles ahead. You can't miss it if you go along the stream. I can well imagine how distressed you are with your footgear worn out, but alas, I have not even a single new pair of straw sandals. If you don't mind my old ones, I would be glad to offer them to you." How strange. A woman in such a mountain hut? Oh well, she might be a huntsman's daughter. My soles are all aches, I thought busily. The right small toe and the left big toe have torn nails. I couldn't possibly walk another 1.5 miles. I better ask for a night's lodging here. I hate to impose on you, but now that I know it's another 1.5 miles to Ogawa village, I realize I can't drag my tired body any farther. Please take pity on my aching feet and let me stay for the night. That's out of the question, since we have no man here. So saying, a woman stepped out, opened the door, and leaned halfway out, silhouetted against the glow of the light from behind. She was about 25, a veritable heavenly maiden adorned with a halo. Fair of complexion, eyes clear and large, eyebrows long and soft, mouth small and tight, her straight and abundant hair, obviously washed quite recently, was casually thrown back with only a pair of string loosely holding the ends. Startled by her ethereal beauty, I moved a few steps back and stared hard to see if she was not a specter. "What a pitiful sight you are," she exclaimed, studying me. "Have you hurt your feet? I see red stains here and there. Your sleeves are torn and ripped, probably by twigs and grass blades. How terribly pale and weary you look. To be sure, you will have difficulty covering even the short distance to Ogawa village. I really ought not to let you stay here, you know. Nevertheless, you are not a monk, so I cannot very well advise you not to leave your heart at a temporary lodging. I'll bend my principles this once and let you spend the night here, for I haven't the heart to say no." She somehow gave me an eerie feeling, but at that point I could not bring myself to flee. "Oh well, what else can I do?" I told myself and sat down. While I was still thanking her, the woman fetched a pail of hot water and started assiduously washing my feet. "This is embarrassing. I can do it myself." "No need to be embarrassed. Please, stretch out your legs." While we exchanged such remarks, my feet were cleaned, even between the toes. I stepped up to the matted room and exchanged formal greetings with her. "Living on the mountain as I do, I haven't much to offer," she explained with a smile. "Fortunately, however, at the back of the house is a hot spring that flows from the same source as the Ogawa villages. You should take a bath and recover from the day's fatigue. Please follow me. If you'd like, I can scrub your back." While I was afraid that a fox might be playing a trick on me, the woman led me to the bath by the hand. "I call it a bath," she said, "but actually it's a modest lean-to, barely adequate to keep off the rain. It's hot water, nevertheless. The hot water, nevertheless, is from a miraculous natural spa that will warm you to the bones." The tub looked clean and safe enough for me, and I soaked in the clear hot water, which proved even more satisfying than the famous Shuzenji hot spring. Shedding the miseries of the day, I emerged quite contented. The woman was waiting for me. "You may not like wearing such things, but please try these on while I mend your clothes." She helped me into a light flannel kimono and a cotton-padded black silk robe. Being women's wear, they were too short in the sleeves and my arms jutted out comically. But I appreciated her kindness and expressed my gratitude. To be honest, I was more than a little bewildered, wondering what karma had ordained my encounter with such a mysterious hostess. "Since your sash is soiled by the moss from rocks, this will have to do for now, even if it looks somewhat improper," said the woman, smiling as she handed me a thin scarlet crepe belt. I obediently wrapped it around my waist, resigning to the possibility that it might be made of bewitched wisteria vine. When I sat down by the hearth, she slipped a warm, gray-checkered nursery coat over my shoulders. "Heaven forbid I should let you catch a cold after the bath. Surely I would be held accountable by a certain lady somewhere, wouldn't I?" she said with a knowing smile, adding large quantities of wood to the fire. Presently an iron pot came to a brisk boil, and she took it down from its hook. "You must be famished by now. Supper is ready. To my great regret, it's only rice mixed with barley, but at least it's hot. Please excuse the inconveniences of mountain living." She set up a butterfly-legged 10-inch square tray and served a bowl of bean paste soup overflowing with the delicious aroma of mountain asparagus. Gratefully, I proceeded to enjoy it. "Perhaps I shall join you and finish my supper too." Without ceremony, she began to eat. Lacking her own tray, she was about to place her bowl on the wooden frame edging the horizontal hearth cut in the floor, but she hesitated for a moment, obviously unaccustomed to such an arrangement. "Please, use this for yourself," I offered, pushing my tray towards her. "In that case, let us try what they call the tete-a-tete. Well, allow me," she said without even blushing. I found her behavior since my arrival quite beyond my comprehension. After the supper, she quickly cleared the tray and dinnerware, sat close to the lamp, and set about mending my torn clothes by the flickering light. It was most baffling to see a woman behave without pretension or coquettishness, as if she were my wife of 10 years. What or who could she be? I wondered inwardly. Her black hair was too long and supple for a religious recluse, and obviously she was not a nun. Then why live deep in the mountainside all alone without a man to appreciate her beauty? To my own vexation, I was such a poor conversationalist that I was still struggling to form a question when she finished mending my clothes. Leaving them neatly folded in a stack, she came over and sat facing me across the hearth, smiling. "I have no idea why a young man like you would take a trip like this, but you must have had some interesting experiences in your life." "Not at all. Much as I enjoy traversing the mountains, I can't even compose a decent poem, for I simply have no literary talent. From what I've seen so far, you yourself seem to be leading a life of elegant taste. I presume you are a woman of high birth? Yet you, a young maiden, lead a secluded life in a desolate mountain hut. If you can tell me about the circumstances which lie behind this. Far from it, she laughed. What momentous circumstances could possibly affect the life of such a humble person as myself? I'm just a carefree woman called Tae, who moved here only last year. And you? A carefree man who calls himself Rohan. Oh, you declare yourself to be carefree. That's right. On what basis are you carefree? It is simply that I feel merry over mountains and rivers without knowing why. What about you? Carefree merely from renouncing the world. I don't believe it. If you had really renounced the world, you would be dressed in a black robe with your head shaven. You ought to be gathering flowers by the mountain path in the morning and dipping the pure water from the valley stream in the evening to offer before the Buddha's image. And you would most certainly perform religious services every day, reading sutras and chanting the Buddha's name. Yet, aside from having no rosary in your hand, for whose sake do you keep your black hair so long and abundant? Some women of long ago are said to have gone so far as to burn their own faces with a hot iron upon forsaking the world. And your silk underground shows sensuous, gay shades, though lacking red. I can hardly believe what you say. Are you merely pretending to hate the world? Perhaps you had some reason to spite your lover, and, in the course of a quarrel, you hid here to sulk. It's a well-known scheme to recaptivate the heart of a man who is showing signs of growing weary of his love. Right? Oh, I beg your pardon. I got quite carried away by my own imagination. My, how dreadful. It's not for any such frivolous reasons at all, but honestly to escape the world that You are being facetious. Otherwise, you can tell me the exact reason why you left the world. While you are asking needless questions, alas, the night grows late. It's time you went to bed, she said, reaching for the closet, taking out the bedding. I expected thin cotton mats, but to my surprise, she spread a mattress of scarlet damask silk, and a sleeved coverlet of blue figured satin, a plate with red silk lining, and a sea otter fur collar. Prodigiously opulent. Now, please lie down. She pushed me toward the bed and set up a small folding screen around it. Well then, with your leave I will. I lay down, forced to break off our conversation. The round brocade pillow graced by the cranes riding the clouds pattern would no doubt inspire a dream of the supernatural Hodai mountain. It was probably stuffed with tea leaves. What with its elegant aroma and the unresolved suspicion lingering in my mind, I found it impossible to fall asleep despite all my efforts. As I peeked from behind the screen, the woman sat like a beautiful doll, reading something by the sunken hearth. Still wakeful, and after an hour had passed, I peered out again and found her in the same position. 2 hours later, no change. By midnight I was wide awake, recounting in my mind everything that had transpired since my arrival. When I looked once more, she was stirring the ashes with iron chopsticks. The logs had already been quite consumed, and the hearth no longer provided much warmth. She must have felt the chilly wind from the wildwood pass, for mumbling that she would take a bath, she disappeared towards the bathroom. In a little while she returned and sat up by the hearth with its fire almost gone. She seemed to have nothing particular to do. By then it was quite clear to me that there was no other bedding in the house. As a man, I felt ashamed to be lying under warm covers. Pretending to have just awakened, I quickly slipped out of the bed. "Washroom?" she asked and showed me the way. Upon returning, I assumed a surprised expression and said, "Miss Tae, haven't you gone to bed yet?" "No, I haven't." "I don't know whom you are expecting to come courting, but it must be quite late by now." "Stop teasing me and go back to sleep, please." "Well, if I am wrong, I apologize, but you seem to live alone. In begging for a night's lodging, I'm afraid I robbed you of your own bed. If that's the case, I'm a man who has slept in the open before, so it's nothing for me to spend a night just leaning up against an upright beam. But it pains me to see you sitting up like this. You might find my remaining warmth disagreeable, but please take this bed." "Since I agreed to put you up," she said, blushing slightly, "I was determined to stay up through the night. Please don't worry about me." No, that's not right. Please don't say no." "You're giving me a hard time." "You, sir, are giving me a hard time. Now, please take the bed, Miss Tae. You take it yourself, I beg you." "Well, this could go on forever," I said at last. "I am a man, and, therefore, will take my leave this minute to face whatever hardship lies outside. It would be an eternal disgrace for me to sleep comfortably while leaving a woman to suffer privation. I would be ashamed to face my mother and friends." By comparison, a night journey would be much easier to bear. If you insist that strongly, I can hardly contradict you. Should I let you travel in the dark now, my good intentions would come to no avail. I, therefore, will comply with your wishes. But it's as if I had you warm the bed for me, isn't it? How could I let you sleep on the floor by the fireless hearth and tuck myself cozily in bed? Even if I see my love in my dream, I couldn't possibly enjoy the meeting. There is also such a thing as female pride. I must have you sleep comfortably, or I would be ashamed before the Buddhas in my eternal disgrace. When you put it that way, I don't know what to do. I am just a simple, unsophisticated soul. In that case, please take my advice and go back to bed. No, you take my advice. You need not insist so stubbornly. Stubborn or not, you should listen to me, Miss Taia. Well, well, I can't fight your stubbornness. I had better obey you. What a frightful face you are making. She laughed. I was born with a frightful face. Are you angry now? Why should I be angry at your kindness? I've become a little serious, that's all. How sweet. Serious, you say? She laughed again. Yes, serious. Well then, I will speak seriously too, Mr. Rohan. What? Do you think that as long as a man gets his way, a woman's wishes need not be granted? What do you mean? You force a soft-hearted woman to accept your way, and do you mean to declare heartlessly that it does no harm to her pride? I don't know. You don't know. That's cowardly of you. Now come this way and get in bed with me. I honor your wishes, and you honor my wishes in return. It wouldn't contaminate or dissolve your body, would it? Why are you so stiff and tight? It's very unfeeling of you. Her soft hand captured mine firmly. She was beautiful and at the same time almost menacing as she pulled at me with unabashed composure. Chilled to the marrow with terror, I closed my eyes, clenched my teeth, and mentally recited the Chinese poem, Elimination of Desires, by the Emperor Wen of Wei. In the boundless oceans of sins, there is no greater evil than carnal desire. In the tumultuous world of dust, there is no sin easier to fall into than the lascivious pleasure. Captivated by it, dauntless heroes destroy themselves and cause the downfall of their countries. Great men of letters violate their integrity and disgrace their names because of it. In the beginning, it is a simple matter of one's willpower, but in the end, one is beyond redemption for the rest of one's life. Why is it? When the wind of lust grows in its force by the end of the day and the law of heaven perishes, men take pride in committing deplorable misdeeds in pursuit of success. They know no shame in practicing the vice that ought to outrage everyone and ought to be despised by all. They write lewd stories and comment upon female beauty. They rivet their eyes on the charming woman on the streets and break their hearts over the graceful radiance of noble ladies. Where they should praise and respect women already chaste and virtuous, they seduce them into transgressions. When they should be compassionate and judicious towards maidservants and female attendants, they resort to force to dishonor them forever. They bring shame upon their own relatives and disgrace upon their own descendants. Men behave thus because their minds are ignorant and their spirits impure. The wise shun them, while only cajolers fraternize with them. How can they fail to see it? Heaven never sanctions their behavior, and gods tremble in wrath. Some of their wives must atone for their sins, and sometimes their offspring suffer the retributions. There are no extinct family tombs that are none of the lunatic followers of sensuality, and the ancestors of prostitutes were debauches without exception. Those who could have amassed wealth find themselves excluded from the noble palace, and those who could have attained honor find their names eliminated from the golden roster. In life they meet with all 5 penalties: lashing, clubbing, labor, exile, and capital punishment. After death they suffer the agonies of the 3 spheres: hell, beasts, and hungry demons, where their previous good karma exhausts its beneficial effect. Of what use is the romantic life of the past then? Which is better, to disregard advice only to regret it later, or to have sense enough not to fall into sin in the first place? I respectively counsel good young men and the eminent persons listed in the golden roster to break the spell of the demon of lust by exercising the power of determination. The fair face of a flowery beauty is nothing but a flesh-covered skull, and gorgeous makeup and adornment are only lethal weapons. Even if a woman has a face as beautiful as a blossom or jewel, one should be prepared to regard her as one would one's own sister. Those who have not yet transgressed should guard against taking wrong steps, and those who have already fallen into deadly course should lose no time in reversing their direction. It is my hope that my advice will be widely observed, and that men will lead one another out of the labyrinth onto the path of universal awakening. With the greatest evil eradicated, all other spirits will vanish of their own accord. Only then will the spirit be free to enjoy the eternal glory of life. Part 2. Not nearly as saintly as Lu Shōwa Hui, I was nervous enough merely being under the same roof with a woman in the bloom of her youth, as beautiful as spring blossoms in profusion. At first I said to myself, no matter how many million worldly men should approach and criticize me, I have a clear conscience. And why should I be troubled by the harmless buzzing of mosquitoes? And I stayed at this house, sharing the supper tray and conversing with this woman. Although I am by nature quite unperturbed by gossip and criticism, how could I allow myself, with only heaven as a witness in such a remote mountain, to sleep under the same cover with a woman who was a stranger to me? Even if my conscience is clear, how could I possibly fall asleep with her soft body so close, our mutual warmth pressing through the scant folds of our clothes? As it was, when she merely made the suggestion, I had to chant the elimination of desires under my breath, for my mental state was not exactly as dispassionate as if I were pondering the Zen riddle of an old woman burning down a meditation hut. If I should actually share a bed with this enchanting woman in a mountain hut, far from any censuring eyes, could I remain as imperturbable as a withered tree leaning against a cold rock? To be sure, even the eminent Abbot Ikkyu of Daitoku Temple confessed that if an attractive woman promised her favor for a night, a withered willow in its old age would produce a new shoot. Be on guard, I whispered myself. Only on the mountainside, uninhabited by woman, can one remain as enlightened as an arhat. The saintly wizard of Kume is said to have fallen from the cloud when he caught sight of the fair legs of a young maiden. Had he slept with her in the same bed, he would have plummeted right through the depths of the bottomless hell. Even if I tried to behave myself impeccably while lying pillow to pillow under one coverlet with this lovely, tender-hearted woman, spending the night without mishap might be far from easy. We are getting chilled as the night wind from the ridge goes through the space between our backs, she might say. Pulling the cover grace fully over my shoulders, she might entreat, please turn towards me to keep out the draught. It would be difficult for me to keep calm under such circumstances. It would be nearly impossible with her down locks brushing against my cheeks and her radiant face right in front of my nose. Where would she put her exquisite arms? Where could her breasts hide? This is indeed a serious situation. How could I manage to sleep as placidly as if I were holding a female cat in my arms? Oh, no. Suppose our clothes became undone through casual movements of our bodies, unseen, under the cover, and what if her well-contoured legs or shapely feet happened to touch my own hairy shins? Good heavens! That would be a moment of life or death for me. Being a mediocre man, basically quite shaky in willpower and almost remiss in observing the moral commandments, I would certainly lose a peaceful night's sleep. That is, if I were able to control my baser instincts. Besides, is she really a human, or a fox, or a badger in human disguise? Her behavior has been altogether suspicious. She shows no sign of embarrassment in saying things that ordinary women would be unable to mention. Who else could she be but a goblin? I have heard that a petty man often takes his approach in a humble attitude, and the devil always seduces with kindness. Well, come now, you devil. An iron fist knows no ambiguous human emotions. I will bring it straight down over your head to show my fearsome strength. Then again, it may not work. While I am a mere mortal not nearly as powerful as the deity Fudo, the devil may have the might and main of Mahesvara, who challenged Brahmada himself. It would be the poorest of poor tactics to slap the water only to get soaked, or to beat the grass only to rouse a snake. How should I answer her? What should I do? I did it again. Oh, I remember now. Some time ago I heard an anecdote about Basho. When the renowned haiku poet had his sleeve caught by a woman, he remained immobile and silent. As the dejected woman turned her last to leave, Basho caught her sleeve from behind and surprised her with an haiku. Torn toward me, I am too lonely this autumn evening. Following Basho's example, I decided after all to remain silent. Practicing in my mind the completion of the 9 stages of human corpses, I sat down with a stupendous thud as if to snap apart heaven and earth. Quite impatient by now, Taia increased the pressure of her grasp in my hand. Why are you hesitating? Please, come this way, this way. She began to pull at me, tugging all the harder as I strained with all my might and determination to resist her. I'm asking you to come this way. What an obstinate man you are. You certainly don't act like one who is used to making merry over the mountains and waters. How dreadful if I should be forced to take even a single step by this goblin, I thought, greatly alarmed. I turned myself as rigid as the stone statue of Jizo, the guardian of travelers, but still she tried to drag me. My guard weakened for a second. In spite of myself, I let out a scream, shook my hand loose, and fled. She came after me and caught my sleeve. Now I see. You must take me for a goblin or a specter to loathe me this much, she laughed. I made the offer believing you were a man of stout heart and virtuous spirit. It's my fault that my kindness worked against itself to cause you such a scare. Honestly, I am neither an evil specter nor a nun shamefully driven by amorous desires. At any rate, I would not force you to do what you detest so much. But if I let you make your journey at night now, I fail as a hostess to my immeasurable regret. Please, sit down, by all means. Afraid to refuse her outright, I took a seat on the other side of the hearth. She picked up a hatchet and stood up. Again, I was startled and mystified. Noticing my expression, she laughed but put on sandals and went out through the front door. Soon I heard the sharp sound of cracking wood. I hurried outside to help her, relieved to realize that she had gone out to chop some wood. If you are making firewood, please let me lend you a masculine hand, I offered and borrowed her hatchet. Cutting down some nearby trees, I brought an armload of logs into the hut and closed the door tight. As I sat down facing her, she raked up embers and added new firewood. Before long, the fire was burning briskly, and the warmth filled the room. As you can see, it will be quite comfortable for me to stay up alone by the fire. So please, rest your mind and go back to bed. I apologize for having frightened my timid guest. Please, go to sleep without fear now, Taia said with much laughter. No. As I said before, I want you to take the bed. Are you being stubborn again? Well then, shall we sleep together? I would rather not. If you don't like me, there's nothing I can do about it, she laughed again. To be honest, since there wasn't much else I could offer you to be hospitable in the cold night in the middle of a mountain, I thought I would hold you tightly and warm you in my bosom, just as your wet nurse used to lull you to sleep in her arms. I meant well. In the sight of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, I swear that I haven't the slightest design of a questionable nature. A fine specimen of a man you are. I didn't think you were the kind of weak-willed man who must worry about becoming emotionally involved with a woman who happens to spend the night in his arms. But you are indeed cowardly and unsure of yourself. Pardon my tongue. At any rate, you do what you like. As for myself, I, as a hostess, can't very well allow myself to monopolize the bed, can I? Struck dumb with amazement, I listened to her words and reflected deeply. Not only did she seem indifferent to worldly convention, but she even behaved as if I were a 3-year-old. She appeared, moreover, as self-assured as a great wise man so enlightened that it was always springtime in his heart. I grew all the more suspicious of her. Whose daughter is she? What specter's disguise? She could not be an ordinary woman. What personal circumstances forced her to retreat to such a mountain hut for all of her fine looks and tender heart? Is she a present-day Kogo? Hotoke Gozen? Gyo? Gijo? Or is she altogether a goblin? Increasingly frightened, I said, all right then. You are free to do what you like, but I, for my part, will take the liberty of spending the night by this hearth. I don't mind keeping you company either. In fact, I would feel much better that way, said the woman. Now that our bickering was over, I felt relieved enough to be able to scrutinize her more carefully from tip to toe. She was like a flawless jewel, a goddess shimmering in and out of the fire's flames, whose beauty and graceful dignity surpassed anything that could be depicted by a human artist. One would hate to place a deer in thorny bushes, and one would expect a crane to perch on an old pine tree. It must be human nature to wish an extraordinary person, a noble person, a lovely person, and a beautiful person to find the places they deserve in the world. An excellent horse ought to carry a hero, a butterfly ought to sleep in the garden of celebrated flowers. Once at an inn, I saw a janitor drop a copy of the Political History of Japan from his pocket while cleaning the floor on his knees. It brought tears to my eyes to imagine how mortifying it must be for him to waste his lofty ambition on such a menial service. Even more so in this woman's case. How pitiful that she should bury her natural beauty in obscurity, like a tree in the remote mountain valley whose blossoms are never to please human eyes. Heaven works in heartless ways, denying a beauty her deserved lot and placing her in a city grass hut. Just as a man of conviction would rather cast himself into the vast ocean if his beliefs are rejected by the world, this woman of refined taste and dignity, transcending mundane emotions almost to the point of perfect enlightenment, perhaps intends to end her life on this distant mountain away from the maddening crowd. If so, how inexcusable that she, as a woman, should behave like a man. A woman being so unfeminine and a man being unmanly are both against nature and utterly repulsive. On the other hand, when a woman acts unfeminine and a man unmanly, in an almost divine way, they've both attained the sphere of the holy. What this woman says is no longer feminine. It must be most difficult for her to propose sleeping with me in her arms, a man whom she has just met for the first time. Moreover, if she actually meant to hold me as a wet nurse would a small boy, she can't be a masculine woman, but an extraordinary, superior being. Common mortal that I am, I would rather see her married to a suitable spouse, making a happy home in the mundane world, than to find her here, so noble and saintly. I glanced up at her once again. To see the way she sat there upright, almost majestic, I could not believe that she was one of those avarice-driven mortal women who suffer in love, fret over matching clothing, or fuss with coral beads and tortoise-shell combs. Her clear eyes betrayed that she was undisturbed by the trivial matters of the world. Her freshly glowing complexion revealed that, far from finding her present lot distressing, she was fully satisfied with it. And her firmly set lips attested to the keenness of her wisdom in discerning right from wrong. Absolutely mysterious. No longer able to bear it, I began carefully expressing my thoughts. As I mentioned before, I find it strange indeed that you, a young woman who is not a nun, should be living in a mountain retreat. For one thing, I find it lamentable that such charming looks and tender heart, you should be hiding in a remote place populated by wolves and wild boars. If you don't mind, I would like to know why you live here. Well then, she laughed, do you intend to write me up in a novel, which I hear is a very popular form of entertainment nowadays? Or perhaps you wish to take my story back to the city or people as a souvenir. There's no sense in revealing my shameful background, but if people hear my story and anyone happens to feel a little sympathy for me, it will be my best consolation. So I'll tell you the story of my unworthy life. I was led to weep and laugh by causes not of my own making, but all that is a mere memory of a long ago dream. Now that I know confession marks the end of a love affair, I shall not hide anything, she added, adding more logs to the fire. Part 3. Taya's expression at that moment was divinely animated yet gentle, like a moon afloat in the dreamy spring sky over the Yangtze River after a gentle breeze has wafted the clouds away. Her eyes radiated happiness like the sultry mist around Mount Randan, softly shimmering on a jewel. Please listen to my story, Mr. Rohan, she began. I was raised in Tokyo by my parents, who were not exactly destitute. As far as our ample family resources allowed, I was treated like a butterfly, while young enough to ask if the dewdrops were hair ornaments for the pampas grass, and cherished like a flower when old enough to shelter my long crepe sleeves from the breeze. Years came and went while we enjoyed a peaceful life. I grew taller with each new battledore given to me at New Year. After the untimely death of my father in my 14th autumn, however, there was to be no end to my sorrows. Having seldom wept before then, except over sad plays, I became constantly given to tears. After we sent my father off with a streak of crematory smoke in a desolate field, 3 times daily his seat at the table was vacant. It was as if a front tooth were missing from an otherwise perfect set. There was only Mother left, crestfallen and cheerless, picking at the food as if she hardly had the strength to lift her chopsticks. I was disconsolate to see her grief, but the sight of her sorrowing daughter must have burdened her careworn heart even more. She seemed to subsist almost solely on warm water. As her eyes moistened with suppressed tears, food would lose its flavor in my mouth, and I found it hard to open my clenched jaw. I kept to the house more and more, abandoned the samisen which I used to enjoy playing, and failed to resume my Kōda lessons after the morning period was over. I spent my time reading and derived some pleasure from my mother's storybooks, which described many things, real and unreal, until reading became a habit to me. I went on to consume the classical tales such as the Tsuyuki, Sumiyoshi, Ise, Taketori, and within 3 years even Genji and Sagoromo, which were quite beyond my comprehension. The tales made me ponder on the kindness and coldness of human nature and taught me to discern truth from falsehood in worldly matters. I also observed that, since olden times, men have always been superficial beings who love and care, but for a time. Their desire intense, but their patience thin. They delight in meeting women, but never grieve over parting, preferring those who coquettishly flatter them, glory recklessly in love conquest, and admire a woman for the beauty of her appearance, just as they would cherish a dog or a cat for its fur markings. Although I had nothing personally to do with them, I vehemently loathed amorous men like Prince Genji and the poet Narihira, and far from being jealous, I felt impatient contempt for the foolish women who were infatuated with such profligates. When I was 18, my aged mother was taken seriously ill. Being an only child, I was totally helpless. Tearfully praying to gods and Buddhas day and night, I looked after her, but all to no avail. "When I am gone, open this box, and learn your place in this life," she said, and bequeathed to me a small, black lacquered box with a blue shell inlaid design of petals floating in a stream. I was so anguished and overcome by her death that I could find no words to express my grief. After the funeral, I opened the box and found a farewell letter that my mother had written unbeknownst to me. With tears of gratitude for her profound love, I read it. Oh, how excruciating, even now, to remember the shock. The horror, grief, resentment, despair, despondency, repulsion, humiliation, helplessness, every abominable feeling there is in the world welled up within me. I felt as if ice-cold water had been poured over my head, and at the same time as if my eyebrows were being seared in a fierce flame. Cold precipitation drenched my sides, making me shiver uncontrollably. Only darkness lay before my eyes and in my heart until my flickering life seemed to be about to expire then and there. From that moment on, I shunned the outside world and all the more resolutely. "Sorry to interrupt," I said. "Why did the message in the letter terrify you so much?" "It's too painful for me to maintain what was written in that letter. Now, to get back to my story," Taika continued. I turned 19, growing older fruitlessly. Close friends of my late parents offered to arrange my marriage to their sons or acquaintances. How shamefully hypocritical of them, and so soon after my loss, I thought suspiciously to myself. They were merely attracted to my looks, which would bloom for but 10 years, and my wealth, which can be spent but once. I gave my servant strict orders to decline every proposal. With all my heart I longed for my mother and prayed impatiently, "May my body dissolve soon, turning me into an ethereal spirit so I can join my mother." Life was no longer dear to me, and I found no pleasure in this world. I left untouched the numerous booklets that I had once read with such absorption, and I came to abhor meeting a man face to face. I was even offended when naughty maidservants gossiped about handsome young actors. Naturally, my hair was without the fragrance of hair oil, combed with no style. Much less did I concern myself with the quality of a tortoiseshell comb in my forelock, or worry over the sustainability of dappled cloth for tying my hair. Rouge and powder were completely forgotten. I no longer took pains to pick out the right sashes, to select the right thongs for my clogs, or to coordinate my wardrobe. I was rid of all feminine concerns. Through the tears filling my woe-begone heart, even heaven and earth looked dusty. Flowers bloomed, but I was wilted. Birds sang, but I was silent. The silvery moon cast no reflection on the turbid waters of my heart. I merely slept, woke, and ate in melancholy indifference. In my anguish I resented gods, Buddhas, people, and even heaven and earth. My agonizing rage against gods and Buddhas intensified to such an extent that I would have stabbed them with a needle had they but manifested themselves in tangible forms. I was no longer bound by the rules of propriety, which are as perishable as a lampwick, nor did I find any comfort in the human sentiments as evanescent as coloring on icicles. Frost and snow weighed cold in my heart, and tragic thoughts never left my mind. Then one day a fine, lacquered rickshaw stopped at my gate, and out stepped a man with an imposing mustache, apparently a government official. According to his calling card, he was a director of a certain government bureau, an imperial appointee with the first rank, reputed to be a man of great influence. My old butler, who had been managing the household as my guardian, received the visitor and asked him the purpose of his call. "I apologize for this sudden visit," said the man, "but, in the absence of a suitable intermediary, I must make the proposal directly. Excuse me for asking such a personal question, but is your young mistress betrothed to anyone? To tell you the truth, the young son of my former feudal lord has fallen in love with your lady, though he has never met her. Let me explain. While the young lord was taking a stroll in the suburb last spring, he passed a certain cemetery and heard some beggars talking. One said, 'The young girl who had just left is not only beautiful, but also touching in her filial piety. She cried her eyes out kneeling before her mother's tomb. Such a young girl, but she lamented that life was dear to her no more, and that she wished to join her mother. Isn't such a tender heart rare in today's women?' 'Did you notice her for the first time?' another beggar went on to say. 'Since last year, when her mother was buried here, she has come every month without missing a single anniversary of her mother's death to mourn in the same manner. She would be a pathetic figure even outside the cemetery. Today her face looked emaciated and awfully pale. More than likely she weeps constantly at home.' Listening to their gossip, the young lord was so moved that he shuddered and shed a tear. That, you see, was the headwater of love and the fountain of longing. He searched for her, not out of frivolous interest, but out of sincere love. In time he learned her name and address. Consumed by the flame of love, he at last asked his father's permission to marry her. That is how I come to call you on his behalf. As far as we know, your mistress has not been promised to anyone yet. Would you kindly consider our proposal? I do not mean to give you a hard sell like a glib-tongued intermediary, but you must have heard of the eldest son of my former lord, his title and his states, if only through rumor. Having recently earned a degree in Germany, moreover, he's assured of a bright future among the ranks of young noblemen. He's neither asking for a frivolous temporary arrangement, nor making his marriage proposal in a condescending manner. In fact, in this age of equality among the four classes, all of us intend to pledge our respect to your mistress as our future countess. I hope you will consider the circumstances and grant us a favorable reply." After the man left, my butler was almost dancing with joy. With his wrinkled face aglow, he tried to persuade me to accept his proposal. At first it made me dizzy to hear that a person of high rank was in love with me, but I soon dismissed it as merely a fleeting male fancy and an ignoble pursuit of beauty. The next moment, however, I recalled my mother's last letter and was instantly sobered. No. I have no ear to lend to any marriage offer," I said emphatically. The astounded butler remonstrated with me, sparing no word or logic and pointing out that it was absurd to decline such a splendid offer. I remained adamant nonetheless, and he had no choice but to decline the proposal. I was unperturbed by the public gossip that I was cold-hearted. After that incident, though, I somehow underwent a change of heart. I no longer abhorred men as intensely as I had before. In time, I even became more careful about my appearance. 3 months later, the same bureau director called on us again. "Since our marriage proposal miscarried last time, our young lord has changed completely from his cheerful and intellectual former self. Now he seldom ventures from the house, and he leaves his favorite books untouched. He is grief-stricken at the sight of flowers or the moon, lamenting, 'It is my greatest sorrow that my life lingers in this world, where my hope is no more. For whose sake should I prolong my useless life?' He eats less and less, spends the day dozing, and tosses and turns at night. His attendants try to comfort him, but he is wretchedness personified. His father counsels him that his behavior is sheer folly, but he only talks to himself night and day, saying things such as, 'If I were gone like a dewdrop that might as well evaporate, would she take pity on me?' I feel no bitterness towards the heartless lady, but I loathe myself for having been detested by her. I wish to give up on my life swiftly." Unable to bear his lamentation, his mother dispatched me again on this mission. "Please try to understand the situation and tell us what you found so unsatisfactory in our proposal. We will follow your every instruction in hopes that his love may be requited." The director made his impassioned plea, appealing to both reason and emotion. Listening behind sliding doors, I was moved to tears in spite of myself. When my butler guardian came to consult me, however, I again recalled the letter, inexorably declared that I did not wish to consummate this match. I cared not if I made enemies of the many persons involved. I thought that was the end of the matter. But the man called again 1 month later. My young lord has reached the point where he is finally took to bed and has been unable to recover. There is no treatment for such an illness. Both parents are so careworn and grieved over the state of their beloved eldest son that it breaks our hearts to watch them. I beg you, use your good offices to intercede with your mistress. This is merely a note that my young lord scribbled in his sickbed, but his heart-rendering love cannot escape anyone's notice. I have brought this in the hope that it would appeal to your lady's compassion. I will also leave this photograph of the young lord before he was taken ill. I shall return tomorrow. No matter what you reply, we would very much like to have a picture of the lady whom my young lord loves at the cost of his health. After he was gone, my old butler counseled me with tears in his eyes. This match seems to have been ordained by fate. You must accept it. But I abstinently refused, and he went away somewhat vexed, leaving behind a photograph. At the sight of his noble and handsome face, I began to feel tenderly towards this young man. Furthermore, my heart was stirred by his forlorn poem, written in an unsteady hand on a strip of paper. In the dead of night, when even the lights grow dim, lying with a faint and faded heart, oh, how I languish for my love. But my mother's letter helped me resolve firmly not to go near such a noble person. The next day I had my butler deliver a hard-hearted reply, and did not even send my photograph. Nearly 10 days later, a carriage came to our gate in a flurry, and the same visitor practically tumbled out. With a tearful look on his tense face, he said, "Dearly beloved, cold-hearted lady of the house, today you need not reply. You simply must come to my lord's residence. The doctor has pronounced that our young lord will not last the night. Please imagine the grief of his parents as well as ours. This morning he composed a poem. Full well I know, my detested self is beyond hope. Still so hard to forsake is..." Without finishing the last line, he spewed blood. Oh, what a woeful sight. After all, his lung sickness was caused by his consuming love. Even if the lady were a demon, should she behave this cruelly towards a man who loves her so? In his resentment and anger, he tried to carry me off by force. I felt more agony than if I were torn to pieces, but still I resisted. At that moment, another carriage came clattering to a stop. Followed by an attendant, a graceful lady came rushing in without any pretense of ceremony. "Are you Miss Tae?" she asked frantically. "My son has made his deathbed request, out of his almost paralyzed lips, to have one glimpse of you in person. I entreat you, with my hands folded in prayer like this. You may be loath to, but please, please come with me." Implored by an august countess, I felt as if my mind were being tossed about in floodwaters. I was taken semi-conscious into the carriage, and soon arrived at the grand mansion, which echoed with desperate cries and sorrowful weeping of women. The lady swept through a number of rooms. Unable to shake myself free from her hand, I followed her into the sick room, where the young lord, worn to a shadow, had just been called back to consciousness. Upon seeing his mother, he wept piteously. So pathetic! Knowing that I was the sole cause of this tragedy, I wished I could dissolve on the spot. The countess pushed me towards her son. No longer able to hold back my surging tears, I held his hand and wept without knowing why. The young lord looked at me, also in tears, but responded only with a feeble movement of his hand in mine. At this point, I collapsed in a swoon. When I came back to life, the young lord was gone, never to revive again. I returned to my house, feeling I could hardly linger in this world. Thereafter, I was haunted by his memory. I regretted having survived him at all, and almost lost my reason, raging against heaven and earth. On the 7th day after his death, his shadowy phantom appeared while I was chanting sutras before our family altar. Mindlessly following the phantom, I left my house to wander blindly in strange places, until I chanced upon this mountain in a state of wretched delirium. Through a providential encounter with an enlightened priest, I was steered towards religious pursuits and settled in a little meditation hut here. In my new abode, the rising water in the valley stream announces the coming of spring, and the falling leaves in the hills foretell the approach of winter. I am able to contemplate an infinite number of wondrous things in my quietude. As I turn my thoughts to the mundane world, I find all people fascinating in their ways. The ice from the horrendous past has melted in my heart. Now I'm even amused by my own existence, as ephemeral as a gossamer in an easterly breeze. I love Buddha as I love ordinary men, I truly love you too. There's not a single thing in the world that I hate. I love birds nesting among the trees, and I love foxes in the holes in the ground. The flower of my heart has bloomed to fill the 10,000 spheres with its fragrance. More keenly than ever, I appreciate the mysterious truth of the conscience-only doctrine. Dissociated from mud, the water is now so clear that the heavenly moon rests on it, and the glistening jewel, the Kira Sutra, is all the more appealing. It's delightful to be pitied and amusing to be detested. It is quite amusing also that you should have abhorred me when I love you enough to hold in my arms. In the past I behaved cruelly, even toward a man who loved me at the cost of his life. And now I love a man who loathes me unto death. How wondrous that even through the changes of heart one can resent or enjoy the same heaven and earth. Thus she concluded her long story, but I still failed to comprehend its true meaning. Well, Miss Taia, what was written in the letter from the small black box with a blue shell inlay of petals flowing in water? Unless you make this cardinal point clear, I can't make sense out of your story. How unperceptive of you. You have yet to learn about human sentiments. If I tell you that the letter made me heartless, you should require no further explanation. Of course, it contained instructions for me to forsake the world, and the reason why I must do so. That's outrageous. There could be no possible reason why anyone must forsake the world. But there is, insisted Saya. All my relatives are compelled to forsake the world, for we have no peace of mind otherwise. That is why at first I resented gods and Buddhas. How preposterous. On the contrary, it makes perfect sense. Our lot is to perish on a remote mountain. People of the mundane world are lacking in insight. While they perceive the various kinds of pathos in life, they fail to realize that, to those of us with our accursed lot, even the sun and the moon appear utterly dark, and the flowers and birds are not at all enjoyable. I didn't readily submit to the young lord's love because I wanted to spare his offspring the same wretched fate. You should imagine my anguish of those days. Suddenly breaking her somber tone with a laugh, she said, Well, I should end such a boring long tale now. It's tiresome to tell stories, and mine is without an end. Love and resentment are actually neighbors. That's that. And this should be the close of my useless rambling. As she fed some more wood to the fire, her beautiful face looked, not as crystal white as that of the somber Chu-yuan of the tragic poet, but as ruby pink as the inebriate Yao Ming, the contented poet. Presently she glanced at me and said, Oh, how regrettable the night is so short. As the day is breaking, our brief encounter must come to an end too. You are a petal floating on the Katashina River, whose scent swiftly travels 10 miles along the rapid stream. I am a willow, standing on the riverbank, whose reflection sinks to the bottom of the water, unable to move a step. The happiness of meeting and the anguish of parting are not reserved exclusively for the morning after lovemaking, you know. No sooner did the sun rise bright and shiny than the house and the woman vanished like a cloud of mist. Alone among the withered pampas grass and left standing from the last year, I found myself, with my bootstring half tied, and a bleached white skull at my feet. One cannot understand by sight, one should learn by inquiring. What cannot be learned through inquiry, one should comprehend through intellection. What cannot be comprehended by intellect, one should perceive through feeling. If I feel compassion for another, he will love me in return. If love and compassion are mutual, I am within him and he is within me. With no distance between us, we perceive each other's emotions and share our boundaries. A skull in a secluded valley attracted the mind of a solitary wayfarer traveling in the present, and that traveler in the deep mountain perceived the former life of the skull. Our karmic paths happened to cross, and we chose not to forego a momentary encounter. With the river water, I consecrated the ground under the tree by which we had spent the night together, and then I buried the skull left behind by the spirit, who had communicated by the vibration of my heartstring in the absence of a divine bowstring. With my hands folded in prayer, I extended by gratitude. Namu Amidabutsu. Thank you for a wonderful night. Hugging the stream, I made my way back to Ogawa village and headed for a hot spring inn. Do you know of someone who has disappeared in the mountains lately? I asked the innkeeper. After pondering a bit with a puzzled look on his face, he said, What a strange question you ask. Yes, only last year a mad beggar woman strayed into the mountain. We heard later that she never reached Nicole. Even now people are wondering what became of her. Are you asking about her? That's the one. Tell me all you know about her. Eyeing me sourly, the innkeeper began. She was a stranger, some 27 years of age. Barefoot and clad in filthy rags, she was leaning feebly on a bamboo cane, a broken hat slung on her back, a sight too loathsome even to describe. Her entire body looked grayish-red with an uncanny purple shine here and there. Her fingers were as crooked as ginger root, swollen in sinuous lumps. Her left foot barely retained 3 toes, one of which was bloated to twice its normal size all the way up to the instep. Her right foot showed a faint scar where the big toe used to be. Her right little finger was like a huge, boneless silkworm, repulsively flaccid, and her left hand was a round, fingerless fist. Her face was even worse, as abominable as a melting copper lion. Her browless forehead bulged prominently, full of purplish hollows, oozing gray-yellow pus, just like rotten oysters, filthier than gutter sludge. Any part of her flesh not coated with pus was exposed mercilessly, red as a baby's tongue. Her sunken nose was a pool of pus. Her upper lip had melted away, bearing sparse yellow teeth in horrible contrast to her shivered, colorless gums. The mouth had festered towards the right side, leaving her cheek ripped halfway open and the molars glaring out. Her hairless head glistened weirdly like a well-rubbed red gourd or a ripe persimmon about to break. Her right eye was merely a wet crater smeared with pus, and the left underlid was turned inside out, vividly displaying red veins. Her remaining eyeball protruded out of the socket, its gazing umber pupil almost immobile, glaring up at man, gods, and Buddhas. From time to time she would heave a sigh as if to vent a body full of venomous air, so repellent that even dogs and birds fled. One look at her and we all felt physically sick. Recalling her foul odor at mean times, we were unable to enjoy the bean soup. Reminded of her pus, we were forced to throw away the delicious salted fish guts. So we avoided her, no one offering her as much as a rice ball. We heard her pitifully groaning out something like a song. She seemed to repeat under her feeble and steady breath, "Abandoned by the world, I abandon the world." She would glower at heavens, wildly swing her bamboo cane, and strike stones and trees by the wayside in a crazed frenzy. Seared by the flames of fury in her heart, she vanished, raging and raving, into thin air. January 1891.
Okay, thank you, Nicole, for the mellifluous, smooth, beautiful reading, as always. We will discuss this work in more detail in class, and I will see you all then. Make sure you read it very carefully, go over all the background information that I gave, all the questions on the study guide, and then we will go over your answers and so forth in class. Goodbye.